does well-being look like to you? This is a question we don't often ask ourselves, but if we want to be quote unquote successful, it's important to consider. This week, I'm talking with Meico Whitlock, a well-being strategist, about how to prioritize well-being both individually and collectively. Here, Meico shares three powerful questions to help us identify what's within our control and take small but meaningful action steps to improve our well-being. He also offers insights to help us better influence the well-being conversation in our workplaces. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Meico. It is so wonderful to meet you. I'm excited for our conversation, and I would love to start by inviting you to introduce yourself.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. Excited to be here to talk with you and hopefully share something that might be of value to the folks that are listening. So I am Meico Marquette Whitlock, and I describe myself as a workplace wellbeing strategist. And I work specifically with mission-driven teams and organizations across sectors on creating a culture of well-being inside our organization so that we can do the great work that we're doing in a more sustainable way. And I come to this work as someone who has worked across sectors, primarily in government and nonprofit. And I'll share really quickly just a story about how I came to this particular juncture in my professional work. About a decade ago, I was working for an organization that was focused on ending HIV and hepatitis, both domestically and internationally. And I was hired as the first ever full-time communications staff person for that organization. And so what that meant is that I was tasked with building out a department, creating a strategy, putting in place all the processes, like all the wonderful things that come with building a new team and a new department for folks that have had that honor of being able to do that work. And I really enjoyed the work. I was passionate about the work. I've been involved in some form of public service throughout most of my career. But if I was honest, as I think about this role and some of my previous roles, I was often feeling like I was on the edge of burnout, trying to do so much to move the mission forward and constantly feeling like I was coming up short, that there wasn't enough time and resources to get it all done. And at one of my lowest points, I found myself in a place of really deep depression. I was overweight and I was really disengaged from what brought me to the work in the first place. And that was really, fortunately for me, a wake-up call where I realized that I could actually drop dead from overwork and have my legacy be that I was good at managing emails and managing projects. And but that wasn't the ending that I wanted for myself. And I realized that there are so many folks like me who are doing this important mission-driven work that are in similar situations. And that low point for me was actually a turning point where I began to ask the question, if everyone is burned out doing this work, if we've normalized this, if we've created a culture around this, where people sort of create a revolving door, people either leave, they go on sabbatical, they come back, and they rinse and repeat, then who would ever be around long enough to do this important work? Who would ever be around long enough to really fulfill the mission and vision of these organizations? And that was a starting point for me personally in terms of shifting what I had disengaged from in terms of my spiritual work and my personal development work. And that was a shift in terms of how I began to engage my team differently and talking about what they needed outside of just the professional skills, but what they needed on a personal level in terms of building that personal resiliency, having those skills to be able to navigate those kinds of stressors in the workplace. And that started this beautiful journey that I'm on now, where I made a decision in 2017 to quit the job that I was doing. And it's like, I want to take this beyond just what I'm doing for myself in this organization, but I want to bring this to the sector into the world. And so that was the start of this journey for doing what I describe as helping folks to have well-being while well-doing.
Oh, I love that expression. And I love the way that you talk about coming to this topic too, because I think for many of us, we just think it has to be this way, right? We don't realize
Mhm.
that it doesn't have to be this way.
Yes.
So how did you navigate that with your sorry, my 1 second. Sorry about that. I just had a tickle in my throat that I had to tend to. But I guess what I was trying to ask you is, I think a lot of us are on an individual journey when it comes to this experience. We may or may not realize that we're on the edge of burnout, and I really love that expression. But we don't necessarily feel like we have the power as individuals to do anything about it. And especially, if we don't have any other frame of reference, we might just think, oh, this comes with the territory. I just have to do it. And I'm watching everyone around me navigate it, usually very quietly. So they seem like they've got it all together. And I start telling myself the story that it must be me, right? So, how do you get from a place of recognizing your own individual experience and then saying, I want to do something at a bigger level?
Absolutely. So I think in the more general sense, just speaking in terms of how I work with teams and organizations, I think that place really starts with helping folks to understand that they're not alone and just really validating your experience right where you are. So we're not trying to change anything. We're just simply, let's get to a place where we can acknowledge, where we can express where you are. And I think for me, at the start of my journey, I was fortunate that I had personal and spiritual tools and community that I could pull on. And part of the learning from that, as I realized I had disconnected from that, because sometimes when we show up in the professional workplace, when people ask, how was your weekend and what you did, people aren't always interested really in that,
Mm.
right? They say bring your full self, but we aren't always interested in that. It's sort of like an unspoken thing that bring yourself to work, but don't bring all of yourself to work. And I think part of what I was experiencing was I felt like I couldn't bring those aspects of me that were nourishing me to the workplace as fully as we talk about inclusivity and all those wonderful things. And so for me, uh, one way that I think about this in terms of to your question, from my spiritual path and my personal development work is that I'm not a victim to life, right? That life is always happening for me, that it's not happening to me. And being reminded of that helped me to really understand in those moments where I was in my darkest place and when I was beginning to make this turning point that despite the external circumstances and situations that are very real, I do have some autonomy in this situation. I do have resources. I may not have all that I need. I may not have all that I want, but I do have access to some things. And so how can I tap into those things? How can I make affirmative choices about the things that I do have control over? And for me, at that low place, I literally asked this question, like, what is in my sphere of influence in this moment? But what was in my sphere of influence was, okay, well, I can make a decision about how I'm choosing to show up for myself and for my work. And I can make a decision about how I'm choosing to manage the team that I have autonomy over inside of my organization. And once I realized that, and that was really the start of sort of, okay, what can I do now that I realize that I have this choice?
Yes, I love that so much because I do think big part of burnout too isn't just overwork. It's a feeling of lack of control, lack of power, lack
Yes,
of autonomy, right? And I think, it happens gradually, but we sort of accept the reality around us as fixed and assume that
yes.
we don't have choices. And I love that what you're saying about just recognizing that however small, right, we always have choices we can make.
Absolutely. And it's one of the places that I start when I work with organizations. One of I think there's no wrong door in terms of how you begin to shift culture inside an organization from a burnout culture to a culture that is what I would describe as a culture of wellness or well-being. And often one of the places I start with teams and organizations is with simply acknowledging number one, like let's acknowledge where you are and let's acknowledge that you have external things that might be impacting some of the challenges that you're experiencing. And we can also acknowledge that even if we put all those things on the table, there are still some things that you can do as an individual or within your teams that can begin to shift how you are experiencing work, that can begin to shift how you are experiencing wellness and engagement with your life and in your work. And so an exercise, for example, that I might give folks is, you know, if you were to give yourself 10 minutes, for example, to call HR next week, put that on your calendar and just inquire about what benefits you have,
Mm.
right? Just inquire, do you have support for grief counseling, for example, if you're grieving? Do you have support for mental health support if that's something that you need? Do you have access to discounted or free fitness classes or passes for your local gym? And that really begins to start people to really begin to think outside the box and say, you know what, I do have, when I stack all of these small things together, I do have enough to begin to help me to deal with my current situation. And over time, what that does is it builds the capacity of you to be able to deal with some of those larger things over the long term.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it's great to do that kind of research before you need it, right? I think it's really hard to strategize when you're in a crisis, and so to be, to in a neutral moment say, I think I'm going to check out my benefits so that I know what's there if I need them, right?
Yes, exactly.
Uh, and so one of the things I wonder about is whether you have seen at a macro level or a micro level issues associated with stigma as it relates to this. And I think part of it is I'm being overly optimistic, but I do think we're getting more comfortable talking about mental health in the workplace. I think it's certainly not perfect, but it's also better than it had been. But I also see a lot of people, and I tend to look at things through the lens of imposter syndrome and anxiety. I work with a lot of people who put a lot of pressure on themselves, and there's often that individual feeling of I should be able to handle this. And if I'm not
Hmm.
handling it well, it's because there's something wrong with me, or I need to work harder, or I'm not as good as the people around me. So it's not the system that's flawed, or, it's not a lack of resources, it's a lack of,
Yes.
my own ability to do the job. And I wonder if that
Yeah.
comes up in your conversations.
So yeah, so every organization is different, but it's not uncommon for a person or a team, or maybe there's a culture inside an organization where um, there is this stigma that in the way that you described it, and that's very real, and it's one of the reasons why one of the first is I start with organizations is around this place of acknowledgement and sort of normalizing what people are feeling and that you're not alone in this. And that for a lot of people can be a place of sort of being able to breathe a sigh of relief, to being able to release some of that pressure and to say, you know what, yes, this is how I'm feeling, but I'm actually not in this by myself. And that can be the start of then beginning to figure out, okay, well, how do I begin to move forward? What's the next step I can take to constructively address what I'm dealing with? Um, and inside of organizations, in terms of addressing this, one of the things that's key to that is you actually have a leadership team that is modeling this, so that you have um, not only encouraging folks to take advantage of it, but you have a leadership team that, your boss, your supervisor, the CEO, et cetera, they're actually modeling what you're asking or what you're expecting of folks inside of an organization. On the opposite side of that, one of the things that I'm hopeful about is that a lot of the teams that I work with, I actually see where there is a normalized culture or people sort of addressing and talking about their mental and emotional well-being, having a robust set of resources to address those, encouraging people to take the time that they need for themselves. And in some instances, we see maybe like an overcorrection
Mm.
where people show up and they're like, well, I have this particular issue with ADHD, or I have this particular issue with anxiety. And it's like, well, you deal with it and you work with it and you figure out how to work around me. And so so there's a range of ways in which this shows up, but it's very real nonetheless.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, I wonder if there are specific don't know if objection is the right word, but like when you start this conversation, are there things that you generally hear in terms of resistance? Like, what are the things that people push back on? Where are they uncomfortable with thinking about this?
I think one of the biggest things is around, do I have time for this? Right? That I think that's another thing that's one thing that folks sort of surface is probably one of the first things that surfaces for lots of folks. Um, I think for some folks, there's a healthy skepticism about what impact or what transformation can look like for them. And I think part of it is bound up in the fact that what we're talking about is, as I describe it to folks, is an ongoing process. And it changes based on the season of life and work that you find yourself in. So it's not a flip of the switch. It's not a checklist of things that you do and you're like, oh, I'm done. It's an ongoing journey and process of assessing and reassessing where you are, what you need, and constructively engaging with at the micro and the macro level what you need to navigate whatever place you might find yourself in. And so that's another place as well where there's a skepticism, which I think is healthy, about, well, is this actually going to have a meaningful impact on, for me? So those would be two things that I would probably bring to the surface. Um, I would also say that in terms of how I interact with organizations, at least at the point that I'm engaging with organizations are generally reaching out to me. And so there's already some level of buy-in by the time I am working with them. I very rarely work with teams or organizations where people are being forced to sort of show up for something or be forced to be a part of a, a journey with me.
Mhm.
And I actually advise against that. I'm a very big proponent of extending an invitation, giving people options, recognizing that there is no one right way to approach it, including for me, that there might be certain folks that resonate with how I show up and how I express and how I connect with folks. Some folks might not connect with that. And I don't take that personally. My invitation is to, how can I support you in finding what might work for you?
Yeah, I think that makes a big difference if you're invited in versus you feel like you're trying to sell them on a concept that they haven't gotten to themselves yet. Right?
Exactly.
And I'm wondering too, because the topic that we're discussing right now is so complex that how do some of the other really important themes fit into it, like psychological safety, right? Or inclusion and belonging? Like, you know, it's great to hear that there are organizations that recognize that they're ready for more help and they're coming to you. But do you find that there are other things that have to be addressed first, or can you do them in parallel? Like, what does that look like?
I think you can, I mean, every organization is obviously different, but I think you can do them in parallel. And my approach to this is I want to start where the client is. I want to meet you where the client is. And so even though I take perhaps I'm always thinking about what the macro looks like or what does a systems level view look like. If an organization comes to me and they say, well, we're really just having an issue with burnout. We're moving into a really intensive fundraising season. Folks are feeling overwhelmed. We're moving toward the end of the year, and folks are just really feeling burned out. I start with just validating what the client has told me, recognizing that at a systems level, that burnout is probably a symptom of something much larger in terms of how the organization is working. Perhaps it has to do with some internal or interpersonal conflicts. Maybe it has to do with maybe leadership styles or management styles inside the organization. But I start with, okay, how can I help an organization or a person experience relief right now? And then we can begin to, over time, address those deeper issues. It's very similar to what we see if we look at like a medical model, where if someone is in crisis, typically what medical professionals are doing is they're treating the symptoms of that sort of that bigger crisis first. You stabilize someone, and then once they're stabilized, then we can talk about the other list of things that might be co-occurring that we need to address the wellness of you as a whole. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually a really good analogy because otherwise I feel like they might never get started because it just feels like where, you had used the door, talking about what door to enter. And I think
Yeah.
it's probably the case that there are lots of organizations that know they need help or they need change, but they don't even know what the first bite looks like, right? It's like,
Yeah.
um, where do I start? And then that really ties back to, I think, what you were talking about too, of really looking at what's within your sphere of control and influence, because even though there's not necessarily one right answer, if you take control of what you can in this very moment, it's going to have a cumulative effect, right? And build momentum as you move forward.
Absolutely. And working in an organization at a macro level, it's the same conversation, right? When I'm starting at, it's like, well, okay, well, budget, time, et cetera, all of those are very real constraints. And so from my perspective, as I think about this, um, I'm thinking about, okay, well, if these are your constraints, then I know that you might not have all the things that you need or want right now, but what can we do with what you do have? How can I point you in the right direction based on the constraints that you do have? So I always see it as a starting point, or perhaps another way to think about it is, okay, you're on a continuous journey, and here's the place that you're at on your journey right now. How can I support you with where you are on this journey, recognizing that you're going to continue to move forward, but how can I support you with moving forward, right? Do you need help changing your tire? Do you need, do you need gas for your, whatever it is, if we're using like this analogy of an automobile, what do you need in order to get back on the road and make it to this next stop on your journey?
Yeah, I really like that. And I wonder, when you talk about what's within your control, there are probably people listening who are saying, like, I have minimal control. I'm not a manager, right? I don't have a lot of
Hmm.
influence over. What are some of the things that, if you don't manage people, if you're not in, higher up the hierarchy, are there certain things that you would encourage people to think about or to do to maybe even influence people above them to consider this kind of a conversation?
Absolutely. So I think the first place to always is to start with any type of change, particularly if you're talking about external change, is to start with yourself. So one of the ways I think about this is for folks that have flown a lot, perhaps you've heard at one time or another the invitation from flight attendants that if, in the event of an emergency, the oxygen mask might drop down to support you. And if to really secure your own oxygen mask first before you step up to help someone else, right? So I think that's one of the first places to start is like, what do you need for yourself to nourish yourself, to fuel yourself first, so that you then have the capacity to sustainably support someone else. Um, and just sticking with the individual for example for a moment now, um, there are a few questions that I could give someone as a starting place, particularly someone that doesn't feel empowered, right?
Mm.
The first is, what is your own personal vision for what you want your well-being to look like, right? So in the next 30, 60, 90 days, if you could just use your imagination to think about like what would you want your well-being to look like or to feel like? That's in most people's capacity to do, right? I'm not asking you to achieve that right now. I'm asking you to ask yourself, what would you like to see in your life? What would you like to see in your work, right? What resources do you have access to right now? I know that you don't have all the things that you want, right? You may not have all the money, the people, the relationships, et cetera, but what do you actually have access to right now? Do you actually have health insurance? Do you have a supportive manager? Do you have a professional development stipend? Do you have the ability to take a half day or a full day off and, the next, quarter or so? What are those things that you actually have resources that are actually in your bucket right now that you have access to? And if you really make it even more granular, I'll give you one more final question here, which is, okay, so now we've done some visioning, we've perhaps done some brainstorming about resources that we have access to. I'm not asking you to do all these things or make a drastic change overnight, but if you could just pick one thing over the next 7 days that would take you 15 minutes or less to do, what would be that one thing? Right? I gave you the example of calling HR before, for example. Maybe that's requesting time off, a half day or full day. Maybe that is, you know what, I am going to prioritize sleep. So, on Sunday, I'm going to make sure that actually I'm going to go to bed maybe a couple hours early so that I can wake up refreshed on Monday morning. Like whatever that might look like for you, what's that one small thing that you can do in 15 minutes that you can commit to do? So that's sort of the individual aspect of it. But for an individual that's trying to influence larger change, that's the starting point, I think. Uh, and then a secondary thing that I could offer in terms of a practical tip, if someone is listening to this conversation, for example, perhaps you could share this with your team or with your supervisor, with the decision maker in your organization, and something along the lines of, "Hey, I heard this really interesting conversation. Some of the things I think maybe we might be able to implement inside our organization. Perhaps we could have this as an agenda item really quickly at our next team meeting, or perhaps could I just share with you some thoughts about this at our next one-on-one?" That could be the start of a conversation. And part of what that does is it takes you out of the loop as the messenger or the expert, and you're simply passing it along, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're
Yes.
simply passing it along and say, "Hey, like these are what the quote unquote experts say, you know, and you're sort of gauging, you're sort of offering it, you're extending an invitation to sort of start a conversation."
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think that's another place where we tend to doubt ourselves is, oh, well, I don't have the expertise myself, so I don't want to go too far down this path, or else people are gonna find out that I don't know what I'm talking about, right? As opposed to just
Mhm.
being the facilitator, the
Exactly.
connector.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. And I know this is a hard one too, because it's all going to be dependent on the situation, but do you think there's a way to kind of think about whether or not you've exhausted your options and you just need to leave the situation? Like, at what point do you decide I've done everything that's within my control and this just isn't working for me?
Yeah, so that's very real, and it's not a conversation that we often have, but it is a place that I invite people to go. I think it's a healthy place to go, and one of the ways that you can get to this place is, with these questions that I just gave you, for example, these three questions, if you're having a regular check-in with yourself, maybe a monthly or maybe a quarterly basis, and you're lining up where you are with this vision that you have and the resources that you need and sort of all the things that you have done, um, that opens up your capacity to be able to make some honest observations about where you are compared to where you want to be. And it's okay if in the professional context, your organization is not aligned with that, and you need something different, right? And so being able to ask questions like this and reflect on these on a regular basis can be a practical way to support you in doing that. Being in community of like-minded folks, particularly outside of your organization, can be supportive as well. That can give you that sounding board to really understand like what's quote unquote normal in the professional context, and you have sort of different perspectives that you can gain from. And that's just critically important, number one, so that you just understand that you're not alone in this, right? And then you're able to get a different perspective on that. Uh, the final thing that I will offer is for folks to be clear about what is the nature of life and work versus what is something that may be untenable inside your organization. Something that observe a lot, particularly in the nonprofit space, is um, sometimes people are searching for something and it manifests as job hopping. And I'm not saying that there isn't necessarily anything wrong at the organizational context. Perhaps there is something that's a bit challenging or maybe unaligned for you in the organizational context. But sometimes it's not the organization that's the issue.
Mm.
You are the center of all of your experiences. And so you want to make sure that you have the support, whether that's with a therapist, whether that's with this community of like-minded folks, or whatever that looks like for you to be able to understand the distinction between what is a dysfunction in your organization that you feel like you can't live with versus what is perhaps something that is in your own sphere of influence that is actually impacting how you are experiencing work or how you're experiencing your organization. It's important to be able to make those distinctions. And sometimes maybe that one of the ways that we figure that out is by making the leap of faith and making that transition. And then we realize, oh, okay, well, this I'm having the same issue that I was having at this last organization. So maybe it's not the organization, right?
Yes. That's a great point. And I think I like the way you said that because I always say like you're the only common denominator in your career, right? Like, and if you're finding that you're having the same issue wherever you go, it's probably worth taking a closer look at what your expectations are, or maybe it's your opportunity is to practice setting better boundaries, or but
Yes.
it's not necessarily the environment that's the problem, right?
And I would offer one more thing, which is particularly with mission-driven professionals, I think there's a tendency to want to seek out what some might describe as sort of 100% alignment and fulfillment. The reality is that there's no person, place, or thing, or situation, or title, or role, or organization that can do that for you. And it's very rare that folks find, I think, what some people are searching for in terms of that sort of alignment, right? Most folks do not find that in their lifetime, right? And so I'm not sure that the best advice is always to um, be pursuing, I guess, quote unquote, like you hear this, like your passion
Mm-hmm.
for the perfect role, the perfect organization. Um, eh, Perhaps an alternative way to think about this is, with your gifts, your talents, your skills, thinking about the opportunities and pathways that can support you in in being of service to that. Um, and so I just want to offer that as maybe a different way to think about this question that you're asking as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it. And I too have that hesitation around encouraging people to follow their passion because I think it sets the bar very high. And there are a lot of ways to find fulfillment in our work that,
Yes.
it's like you're trying to find your work soulmate, right? That makes me
Yes.
really hard to get to that. And I also think, when you think about having these conversations at work, and this one is particularly aligned with some of the mindset challenges that I often see, is there's this fear. There's this fear that if I ask this question, that I'm going to look like I'm less committed, or I'm going to look like I'm not able to do the job. But the way I think about it is that, we can sort of set aside and own for a minute that you deserve to be in the role that you're in, right? If we just assume that like you're doing the job well because everybody that I work with is a high achiever, very
Yes.
high performer,
Yes.
that if you have that conversation, what you get in return either way is data, right? Because either you're
Yes.
going to get support that you're looking for and find out that there is more possible than you imagined, or you're going to find out that your manager is not willing to provide the support that you think is important to your well-being and to your ability to do your job well.
Yes.
And I would personally rather have that information and be able to make an informed decision about what I do next than to live in this, what if or anxiety bubble. Like I don't actually know what my manager is willing to provide because I haven't asked.
Yes. And I think part of that is connected to one of the things I work with individuals and teams is around constructively navigating sort of the emotional and mental turbulence that is inevitable, right? It's an inevitable part of the human experience. You use fear as an example. Um, I remind folks that fear is a natural part of our human experience, right? From an evolutionary biology perspective, we understand that it's something that has served us and continues to serve us in terms of just survival, right? But in the modern context, sometimes it can be overactive and it can indicate danger in instances where maybe there isn't. And what we want to be able to do is to acknowledge and understand that and begin to build the skills and the muscles that we need to be able to determine the difference between when we need to be taking action versus it's just sort of noise in the background. And one of the ways that I describe this is sort of like if you have a puppy and you're out and about and your puppy's barking at everyone and everything, it's perhaps misguided in thinking that it's protecting you in those instances because it doesn't know the difference between a threat and sort of what's a friendly thing or person or place. And over time, most puppies can be trained to respond differently, right? And if you think about befriending your fear and sort of those heavy, those what we might consider maybe in some ways challenging thoughts or emotions, we can learn to be with them in a way that they're not overwhelming, and we can learn to constructively work with them and to be able to discern, okay, what's the helpful information that I'm getting from these thoughts and these feelings, and what is sort of the noise that I can sort of tell to like, I see you, but like now is not the time. Please have a seat, right? You get when you begin to develop those types of skills and to be able to put what's happening mentally and emotionally in those perspectives and those frames, it becomes easier for you to have those conversations like what you're talking about. And you have a healthy understanding that fear is natural. You have a healthy understanding that disappointment is inevitable, right? Like no matter how perfectly you show up or do a thing, someone's going to be, disappointed, or you're going to disappoint someone, and that's okay. And we get to practice forgiveness, right? We get to practice grace. We get to practice compassion. Like all of these things are connected. And I think we we what I hope is that we can normalize supporting people and embracing the full range of these ways that we show up mentally and emotionally so that we can have healthier connections that lead to, greater well-being in the workplace and beyond.
Yeah, oh, that was so well said. I really appreciate that because I do spend a lot of time thinking about that as well. And we're all trying to put on a performance when we're in our workplaces. And sometimes, I think the stress, it gets the best of us, but the ability to acknowledge the fundamental, human experience, like you're describing it, just it goes back to what you were saying before too, this idea that we feel less alone because we're all trying sort of battling the same forces, right? And if we're just silently doing that and thinking that everyone else around us has it all together, then we're on this very lonely journey and we lose access to all of these great resources and community that's available to us and just make it harder than it needs to be.
Yeah, and when you really boil it down, I think when we can be more human in the workplace, that gives permission for other people to be more human. And that creates deeper connection. That deeper connection allows us to have more effective collaboration, deeper engagement with the mission. It allows us to be able to have those honest conversations where there might be conflict or friction or disagreement. And we can recognize those as healthy things and not things to be avoided. And that's ultimately what we're talking about. We're talking about creating a more human experience, or maybe creating more human workplaces. Maybe that's one way to think about it.
Yes, yes, I love that. And oh my gosh, Meico, I could spend all afternoon talking to you. I love what you're saying. But in the interest of time, are there any sort of final thoughts that you have, maybe things that we haven't gotten to yet, or anything you want to reinforce?
Yes, I would just reinforce for folks that this is an ongoing journey, and it's okay to start wherever you are on the journey. And it's okay to start small. I actually invite that. Sometimes the overwhelm that we experience is in thinking that we have to do all these things that we think we have to do in order to be perfect in a particular area. But what if you were to just ask yourself, what is the one thing that I have the capacity to do right now in this moment? And how about I do that thing? And if I do not have the capacity to do that one thing, then who can I ask to support me on this journey? That is, I think, is a solid place for most folks to start. And hopefully that's accessible for most folks as a starting place on this journey.
That is a fantastic place to start. And for anybody who wants more of you, your support, your insights, where can they find you?
You can go to my website, mindfultechie.com. So that's mindfultechie.com. You can learn more about my work. And if you want to join the email list, you can stay up to date on the insights that I send out periodically.
Perfect. And I will make sure that's in the show notes as well. Thanks again, Meico. This has been fantastic.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.